Katrina hit landfall on a Monday morning. That evening, the levees broke and the city filled up with water.
It was physically impossible for African Americans who lived in the Ninth Ward to head back towards the city of New Orleans. The only place for them to go would be to go through St. Bernard Parish.
St. Bernard Parish was overwhelmingly white, and Orleans was 67% African American. So there was this concern that they were purposely being kept out because they were African American.
The St. Bernard police issued a shoot-to-kill order aimed at anyone who was coming across the industrial canal. They barricaded the canal, clearly fearful that folks were going to be coming across from Orleans Parish.
On the other side of the piled-up cars and all the debris, St. Bernard Parish was also in very difficult circumstance. And it was really one of those times when people needed to look past all the issues that divide them and work together. After Hurricane Katrina, both in St. Bernard and in New Orleans, the rental housing market was extremely difficult to navigate.
It was clear in St. Bernard, which got hit equally hard, I mean, if not harder than New Orleans, it was devastated too, that there was an affordable housing crisis.
When you throw up all of the housing patterns essentially into the air, there's going to be great resistance to the redevelopment of rental housing. There's also going to be resistance to the people who lived in that type of housing, and that was predominantly African Americans who lived in the New Orleans area. And St. Bernard Parish took many steps to prevent certain groups from coming back.
One of the first things to happen was in November of 2005. St. Bernard Parish passed an ordinance that prohibited the redevelopment or the construction of any multifamily housing. And in 2006, they decided to take it a step further. They passed what later became known as the Blood Relative Ordinance. And the Blood Relative Ordinance said that in order to rent a single-family home in the parish, you had to be related by blood to the person that owned the home. One parish official was attempting to defend their actions. He said they weren't trying to do anything that was illegal or racist, but they were simply trying to maintain the demographic. The problem with that, of course, is that St. Bernard Parish is a majority white parish. And so when he says maintain the demographic, it's not so heavily shielded code for African Americans, you're not allowed to live here. We filed the initial lawsuit with the help of the Relman law firm. And within weeks of us filing, the parish agreed to not enforce this Blood Relative Ordinance. And we got an incredibly strong consent decree that made clear that the parish couldn't enforce the Blood Relative Ordinance. It also said that the parish and all of its future dealings had to do them in a manner that did not violate any provision of the Federal Fair Housing Act. Even though we got that victory, there was still some concern because we would hear the occasional feedback from St. Bernard Parish that made clear that they weren't satisfied with what happened and that there might be more to come.
Shortly after, Provident Realty Advisors comes into the picture, and Provident in the spring of 2008 had won tax credits to build a tax credit property in St. Bernard Parish. What they do is they create a financial incentive for a for-profit developer to build a mix of housing, that some of which is low-income housing, some of which is market-rate housing, and it allows for affordable housing that would otherwise get built to be built, and where it's going to encourage and increase integration. So if the parish is going to agree to allow multifamily housing and rental housing and affordable housing into the parish, they're accepting the fact that the demographic mix of the parish is going to change. Initially, in the summer of 2008, zoning approvals went through. Provident was told, we welcome you here, we're glad you're coming in, everything will be fine. The parish and the leaders of the parish didn't understand that this was going to be affordable housing. They didn't understand what it meant. Then in August of 2008, an editorial appeared in the St. Bernard Voice.
This editorial by a St. Bernard Parish resident specifically referenced Village Square, which is a neighborhood in St. Bernard Parish that existed prior to Hurricane Katrina that was predominantly African American. He made references to the fact that Providence developments would be just like Village Square, and then he said it would bring crime and the ghetto into the St. Bernard Parish. And just 2 days after that editorial was published, the St. Bernard Parish Council introduced the multifamily moratorium.
They were going back to what was an original ordinance that was discriminatory, not quite as blatant as the blood relative ordinance, but certainly part of the pattern.
They were kind of telling us that this moratorium is for a necessary step in the process, and that eventually we would lift the moratorium with our projects being approved, but we learned that the moratorium had been passed by the Parish Council, and we went to the Louisiana Housing Finance Agency in their board meeting where they're going to be awarding the tax credits, and all of a sudden someone up on the board is saying, we just received a fax of a letter from St. Bernard Parish saying, do not award these tax credits to these developments, we don't want them. This was getting stabbed in the back. When I realized that we needed to take legal action, I contacted Munchhart, Bob Volker, and Dennis Racine. Bob and Dennis began to research what was going on down there in the parish and learned about the consent decree and learned that Relman and Dane had represented Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center in that blood relative ordinance.
When I heard that this moratorium was in effect, and when I heard the story about what had happened to Provident, it was clear to me what was going on, that St. Bernard Parish was right back at it. So we contacted the parish and we said, look, this has both a discriminatory effect and we believe it's motivated by discriminatory intent. They said that this had nothing to do with race. They said that what this was about was the fact that the parish did not, they said, have the infrastructure to be able to host this housing. President Tafaro himself had written a letter before he realized what was involved, saying that they did have the infrastructure to handle all of this housing. Also, they said that we don't have a hospital to take care of these people. Councilman Landry was on a hospital board that was in the final stages of getting approval to build a brand new hospital in St. Bernard Parish that would come online exactly when this housing was due to be completed. It was clear that this was all just a pretext for what was really going on. This was all about race. So it was clear that what we needed to do was to file a motion in court to enforce the consent decree. The judge set a hearing for March, and it was a fascinating hearing because at one point I asked President Tafaro about his involvement in barricading of the roads coming over the canal. And President Tafaro lost his cool, and he yelled at me and he said, "Who do you think you are coming down here from Washington, D.C. and telling us what to do?" The judge issued a very, very comprehensive opinion, and what she said was, this moratorium violates the Fair Housing Act. I find that it violates the consent decree. I find that it's motivated by racial intent, and it has a clear disparate impact on African Americans. And now going forward, you've got to adhere to the law.
After the moratorium was lifted, we started our plans, submitted applications for the building permits, submitted applications for the re-subdivisions, and then you had to be approved by the commission in order to get a property re-subdivided.
At that meeting, about 200 homeowners showed up to object to our planned developments. And it became apparent right out of the box that the Planning and Zoning Commission were very adverse to our projects. They raised lots of issues like crime.
You know that this apartment complex is going to bring crime to our parish.
That we didn't have certain things in our applications.
What type of security do you put in your apartment?
Then they invite anybody who wants to speak in opposition, and it became clear that they were both emotional and hostile to these developments.
I have a problem with someone that's going to be coming up the street, gangbanging somebody, or they kicking the door down every couple of days. They're usually on food stamps, and all they come here is because their baby daddy won't come beat them up.
Provident housing was denied, and so we were appearing before the city council in order to make an appeal of that denial. And things unfortunately went very badly. And the council chambers were packed with people, all of whom were clearly against Provident moving forward with this redevelopment.
The parish council went into executive session at the beginning of the meeting for approximately 2 hours to discuss this case. When the council came back out of executive session, the first thing that Councilman Landry did was to inform everyone there that the council took no action on our appeal and they just sent us back to the Planning Commission.
John Relman attempts to speak before the council and they cut his mic off. They won't let him even make the case. Right? Don't even want to hear him out.
We still do not know what it is that is deficient.
All right. Thank you for your input. Would you please maintain order? I'll have the police escort you out the building.
They wouldn't let me speak. They said because I hadn't actually filled out the card.
I'm sorry?
Here's a card with my name on it.
I don't see it. Thank you.
While I was attempting to speak, there was someone in the crowd who said behind me, "Go back to your ghetto."
The public was, passionate and emotional and fearful, up talking about crime and how this is going to hurt their property values.
Earl Daughtry, who was the chairman of the Planning Commission, simply said, point blank, that there were no reasons why we had been turned down.
There's no answer from the Planning Commission as to why we denied it. We denied it. We denied it.
This clearly was a kangaroo court. It was a sham proceeding, and we were being ping-ponged back and forth. The process was grinding to a halt, and that we were never going to get this through.
Councilman Landry had been posting on a blog discussing with residents of St. Bernard Parish the decision at the May 19th council meeting. One of the residents had expressed consternation that the council hadn't outright denied our appeal. Councilman Landry's response was, since we didn't deny the appeal, this gets around the judge's March order. He essentially was explaining the strategy of doing an end run around the court's ruling.
We ultimately went back to the court and said, this runaround is in itself grounds for contempt and defiance of the court order.
We called Wayne Landry, we called Craig Tafaro, and we questioned them very closely once again on what they claimed was their excuse for why they were trying to get the tax credits pulled. They said, we don't have a need for affordable housing in this community.
We came across some articles that in St. Bernard Parish, the Walmart was reopening and Lowe's was going to be opening a store in the parish. This was, of course, significant because Provident wanted to build developments where these employees could potentially live.
We looked at the rent levels in the parish and the wage levels in the parish, and we saw that 25% of the workers in St. Bernard Parish could not afford market rate rents. All those factors just showed that the analysis of the parish was flat out wrong.
We also cross-examined Wayne Landry. Wayne Landry had himself signed a petition, which he claimed was only in his personal capacity, opposing the Provident development, and his name was right next to people who had made overtly racist comments. What was also kind of a remarkable moment was right before the hearing, the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center received an email.
I received an email from a St. Bernard Parish resident. The subject line of the email read, "Nobody has guts." And then the body of the email read, "Well, I do. We don't want black people in St. Bernard. We don't want public housing."
We were able, through a Facebook site, to actually identify the person from the address who had sent this email. When I was cross-examining Craig Tafaro, I asked him, do you know who had sent this email? President Tafaro said, actually, I do. I wheeled around and said, you do? I literally could not believe that he actually knew who this person was. On the 17th of August, the judge issues her second ruling, and what she says is, once again, you have violated the Fair Housing Act, you have violated the consent order. Provident should have been treated as a minor subdivision request. And I want you to go back now, and I want you to put Provident back on the Planning Commission agenda, and they need to be treated as a minor subdivision request.
President Tafaro came out with a posting on his Craig's Corner website. And it talked about how these Dallas developers, referring to Provident, of course, had, with their federal court ruling, achieved a full house. But the residents of St. Bernard Parish, with their dedication to their way of life, held a royal flush. This article directly equated the federal court ruling with a losing hand.
We had a meeting on August the 25th. I came forward and made a statement, and I basically just recited what was in the judge's order. I said, you now have been told by the judge how to treat these, and so we just ask that you go ahead and approve our subdivisions as minor subdivisions. In response to that, the chairman of the Planning and Zoning Commission said, the judge doesn't get to make this decision. You're here in St. Bernard Parish, and we get to make this decision.
So we found ourselves back in court, in front of the judge, explaining that the parish had continued to, in a very defiant fashion, disregard the intent of her order and her finding of contempt. On September 9th, the judge's demeanor was radically different. She walked in, went straight to the bench, and was direct and stern, and was clearly dismayed by the parish's ongoing defiance of her rulings.
A couple days later, she issued her decision, and she said, I find you in violation once again. This is clear defiance of my order. She then set a schedule and said, you have so many days to review and make a decision on the remaining things that need to be done. And if you miss these deadlines, I'm going to fine you $5,000 for the first day that you're late and $10,000 a day for every day after. So it was clear now that the judge had had enough.
In the judge's order, she notably quoted a remark about leadership, and she wrote, leadership is not finding an angry crowd and getting in front of it to goad it on. A leader takes people where they want to go And a great leader takes people where they do not necessarily want to go, but ought to be.
After the judge ruled on September the 11th, the parish started high-stepping it. It was very refreshing to finally start what I would call a more normal process where you actually have some interaction and they're reviewing your plans and reviewing your application and what you're submitting. It was just like a huge weight came off of us, and we finally got what we were needing to get.
We finally received word on October 1st that the parish was going to finally issue the building permits, to finally get word that Provident was going to be able to build these developments, which we knew there was a need for, and we knew it was going to help the community. It was a great day.
To successfully challenge the parish in their racial policies sets a clear message to leaders throughout the region that this won't be tolerated and that enforcement actions will be brought.
We need people like the folks who work at the Fair Housing Center here in New Orleans. We need people like the attorneys at the Roman Law Firm who are dedicated to continuing this fight.
We will and have changed hearts and minds in St. Bernard Parish. Not everybody, and it's not all right now. It's going to take time. But that's the legacy of this work and the legacy of what we're trying to achieve. And everybody at our firm and everybody that we work with, it's what we're all about. It's about making a difference in this way.
What this ruling does is communicates very clearly to people who want to come home that they're welcome to come home. And we're going to make sure that when they get here, the light is on.